Imagine being denied access to your flight, not because of a mistake, but because of who you are. Now, picture the surprise when the man responsible for that decision discovers the truth, that the one person watching is the very person he wronged. What happens next will blow your mind. Stay tuned to find out. Before we dive into the story, don't forget to like, share this video, and subscribe to the channel to help us reach 1,000 subscribers. Your support means the world to us and inspires us to create even more engaging content. Thank you. John Thompson had been traveling for decades, but today something felt different. The bustling terminal at the busy airport seemed more chaotic than usual. He was no stranger to the hurried crowds, the hum of voices, and the beeping of scanners. But as he stood in line at the gate, clutching his ticket, he couldn't shake the uneasy feeling gnawing at him. John, a tall, broad-shouldered man with graying hair and a weathered face, had the look of someone who had lived through many battles, though none of them in a uniform. At least not recently. A retired veteran, he had seen his fair share of wars, both overseas and at home, and had learned long ago to trust his instincts. But today, something felt off. He had arrived early, just as instructed, and had made his way to the gate, where everything appeared to be running smoothly. That was until he stepped up to the counter to board the flight. The attendant, a young woman with a tight smile, glanced at his ticket, then back at him, her expression unreadable. "Sorry, sir," she said, her voice polite but firm. "You can't board." John blinked, unsure if he had heard her correctly. "Excuse me?" he asked, his voice steady, though the nerves were starting to creep in. "I've been waiting in line for over an hour. I'm here, and I'm ready to go. What's the problem?" The attendant seemed unfazed, tapping her screen as though something more important was going on. "There's an issue with your booking, sir. I'm afraid you'll have to wait for the next available flight." John's heart sank. "But this is the last flight of the day. My family is expecting me." He took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. "Please, I've been traveling for hours already." The young woman offered no explanation. Instead, she just shrugged, eyes flicking past him as if there were more important matters at hand. That was when he noticed them, the group of well-dressed passengers bypassing him, moving swiftly toward the gate with little more than a nod of acknowledgement. They didn't seem to be held up. No questions, no checks. They were allowed to board. Just like that. John's mind raced, but his feet stayed rooted to the floor. Something wasn't right. He had been told there were no issues with his flight. So why was he being singled out? The anger began to bubble up, but he kept it in check. He was too old to start a scene, too tired to make a fuss. Still, the feeling that he was being treated differently, unfairly, made his stomach churn. His mind went back to his years of service, the respect he had earned, and the sacrifices made. None of that mattered now, it seemed, but there was something even deeper gnawing at him. Something familiar about the way the system had turned its back on him. He felt small in this enormous airport, just another old man being brushed aside, forgotten. As he stepped aside, reluctantly, to let the others board, he saw the attendant glance at him once more. She didn't apologize, didn't even meet his gaze. Her attention was already on the next passenger. And just like that, it hit him. This wasn't just a mistake. This wasn't just an oversight. This was something much bigger. All John wanted was to get home, to see his family. But now, with the gate closing behind him, the feeling of injustice lingered. He knew, deep down, that this wasn't going to be the end of it. It was only the beginning. Edward Miller had been sitting in the crowded airport lounge, mindlessly flipping through his phone, when the incident caught his attention. He had seen the old man before, standing in line, patiently waiting for his turn. Edward didn't know him personally, but there was something familiar about the way he carried himself, calm yet hardened by life's battles. As if each step was earned. A retired soldier, most likely, Edward mused. That impression was only strengthened when he saw the way the old man was treated. The scene unfolded slowly, but Edward saw it clearly enough. The elderly man, John Thompson, had been asked to step aside. No explanation, just a quiet, firm refusal from the airline staff, while other passengers, much younger, well-dressed, and undoubtedly wealthier, were ushered through with little more than a nod. It wasn't right. Edward could feel the simmering frustration in his chest as he watched. There was a moment when the man, John, tried to speak up, but his voice faltered. He looked confused, perhaps a little embarrassed, before stepping away, shuffling off to the side as the young woman behind the counter quickly turned her back. He was dismissed as if he didn't matter. Edward felt a surge of anger on his behalf. He knew the old man wasn't making a scene, but the injustice was clear, and it hit Edward hard. Edward glanced around, searching for someone else who might notice. But the other passengers, most of whom were absorbed in their phones or their own conversations, seemed completely oblivious. His eyes returned to John, who stood still for a long moment, clearly unsure of what to do. Finally, he left the line, his face clouded with frustration and confusion. Edward leaned back in his chair, his mind working fast. He could feel the stirrings of something that wasn't just about a bad day at the airport. There was something much deeper here. Something about the way this man had been treated didn't sit right with him. Edward was a man used to authority, used to making tough calls. But in this moment, the decision before him wasn't one of business. Not yet. He didn't know the old man's story. But he knew one thing for sure: John Thompson deserved better. The treatment he'd just witnessed didn't seem like an isolated incident. In fact, it felt systemic, like a symptom of something bigger. But Edward was no fool. He knew the risks of taking action, of drawing attention to what he had just witnessed. He had a position to maintain. As the CEO of the airline, though he kept his identity hidden in public, he was already well aware of the challenges within his company. He'd heard whispers of dissatisfaction among customers and employees alike. But this incident? It was personal. He had witnessed the way John was treated. The question was, what was Edward going to do about it? Did he confront the system now, risk exposure, and shake up everything he had built? Or did he keep his head down, continue to run the company from the shadows, and let things play out? As he mulled over his options, the minutes ticked by. The weight of the decision was heavy. He could feel his palms begin to sweat. Part of him wanted to act, to do something immediately to right this wrong. But the other part of him, the cautious, measured side, knew the risks. What if his actions caused more harm than good? What if it wasn't just the airline's policies he was up against, but something deeper, a much more powerful network that wouldn't take kindly to interference? While Edward wrestled with his thoughts, Michael Dawson, the airline's marketing director, walked past him, oblivious to the internal struggle unfolding in Edward's mind. Michael was younger, always in control, and as far as Edward could see, not the type to concern himself with matters of fairness or the inner workings of customer service. "Hey, Michael," Edward called out, forcing a calm tone. "What do you think of the situation at the gate?" Michael looked over, a faint smirk on his face. "What situation? The old guy?" he asked dismissively. "It's just one of those things. Happens all the time. Some people just can't deal with minor inconveniences. Not really a big deal." Edward felt a flicker of irritation, but he controlled it. "But don't you think there's something off about it?" He wasn't even given a proper reason. Michael waved a hand in the air as if to brush off the entire conversation. "Come on, Edward, don't overthink it. It's not the first time someone's been turned away. Maybe it's his fault for not handling things more diplomatically. People like him can make things worse by pushing back. You know?" Edward stared at him for a moment, trying to hold back his disgust. Michael's attitude toward the situation, his dismissive tone, felt wrong. It was clear that Michael didn't see the same things Edward did: the injustice, the lack of empathy. But it was more than just this one situation. It was the way the entire system operated, the way the company's culture seemed to reflect a disregard for basic decency. As he turned away from Michael, Edward's phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, only to find a message from his assistant. "We have a situation. One of the staff members who was involved in the incident, gone. No explanation. Also, some sensitive customer service policy files seem to have disappeared from the system." The words sent a chill through him. The pieces of a bigger puzzle were starting to fall into place. It wasn't just a random mistake or a simple misunderstanding. Someone was hiding something, and Edward had a growing suspicion that this was more than just a bad day for John Thompson. It was the start of something much darker. Edward's pulse quickened. He knew he couldn't sit back any longer. The decision had been made for him. He had to find out what was really going on, no matter the cost. The question now was, how far was he willing to go to uncover the truth? Edward Miller sat at his desk, his fingers hovering over the keyboard, but he couldn't bring himself to type anything just yet. The weight of the decision hung over him, pulling his thoughts in different directions. The injustice he had witnessed at the airport, John Thompson, a man who had served his country, unfairly treated like a nobody, wasn't something he could just ignore. There was more to this than a simple mistake. He had to know the truth. With a sigh, he leaned back in his chair, his gaze fixed on the stack of paperwork in front of him. He had already begun digging into the airline's internal records, but the more he searched, the more questions he found. The inconsistencies were starting to pile up, policies that didn't add up, customer complaints that were brushed aside, and strange patterns in flight schedules and customer service decisions. It was almost as if certain people were being systematically excluded from receiving the best service. But why? Edward had always prided himself on running a company built on fairness. But now, he was starting to see cracks in the foundation. The discrepancies were too obvious to be ignored, and he knew he had to take action. He glanced at his phone and dialed a familiar number, Sarah Miller, a seasoned investigative journalist he had worked with on a few corporate cases in the past. Sarah was sharp, fearless, and had a knack for uncovering the truth, no matter how deeply it was buried. "Sarah, it's Edward," he said when she answered. "Edward, it's been a while. What's going on?" Sarah's voice was warm, but Edward could hear the curiosity in her tone. He quickly explained the situation, what he had witnessed at the airport and the suspicions he had about the airline's policies. Sarah listened carefully, her usual skepticism giving way to intrigue. "That's a hell of a story. Edward, you've got my attention. I'll see what I can dig up." They agreed to meet at a local cafe, a place they both frequented when they needed to talk in private. The cafe was quiet at this hour, a perfect setting for their conversation. When Sarah arrived, she wasted no time getting to the point. "I've got some documents here," she said, sliding a folder across the table. These came from someone inside the company. They didn't want to be identified, but they felt like this needed to come to light. Edward opened the folder carefully, scanning through the pages. The documents were startling. They outlined customer service policies that clearly favored wealthier passengers, offering them priority boarding, better seats, and other perks, while culling service for those who were considered less important, like veterans or lower-income travelers. There were even detailed notes on how certain groups of people, those with less power or influence, were pushed aside when conflicts arose. Edward's stomach churned as he read the documents. It wasn't just a few isolated cases, it was systemic. This wasn't a mistake, it was part of a strategy. The company was actively discriminating against people who didn't fit the right mold. He looked up at Sarah, his expression dark. "This is bigger than I thought." Sarah nodded grimly. "I figured it would be. The fact that they've been so careful about hiding this, it's not just about the service. There's something more going on here. Something that connects these policies to something much darker." Edward ran a hand through his hair. "So, what's next? How do we expose this?" Before Sarah could answer, her phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen and frowned. "Hold on, let me check this out." She read the message quickly, then looked back at Edward. "You're not going to like this. One of the employees I was in contact with, the one who was going to give me the rest of the information I needed, they've disappeared." Edward's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean, disappeared? Just vanished?" Sarah nodded, her face grim. "Yes, I've been trying to reach them for hours, but their phone's off, and I can't find any record of them coming into work today. No one knows where they are." Edward sat back in his chair, his mind racing. This was no longer just about corporate policy or a bad day at the airport. Someone was going to great lengths to cover this up, and they were willing to go to extreme measures to make sure the truth stayed hidden. "This isn't just a coincidence," Edward muttered. "Someone's trying to keep this quiet, and I think we're getting too close." Sarah folded her arms across her chest. "We're going to have to dig even deeper." "But Edward, this could be dangerous. If they're willing to make someone disappear, who knows what lengths they'll go to stop us." Edward looked out the window, the weight of the situation settling in. He wasn't one to back down from a fight, especially when it involved injustice. But Sarah was right. This was more than just a corporate issue now. It was a battle against a powerful force that would stop at nothing to protect its secrets. "We can't back off now," Edward said, determination hardening his voice. "We need to find out who's behind this. And we need to do it fast. We can't let this go." Sarah nodded. "All right, but we do this carefully. We don't know who's watching." As they left the cafe, Edward's mind was already spinning with the next steps. He knew this wouldn't be easy, but he also knew it was the right thing to do. The deeper he dug, the more he realized that exposing this corruption could bring everything crashing down, but at what cost? Edward sat at his desk, his fingers still tapping on the papers before him. As the weight of the situation continued to settle in, his mind kept returning to the documents Sarah had provided. The unsettling evidence of the airline's discriminatory practices. Every piece of the puzzle was starting to fit into place. And yet, the deeper he dug, the more complicated things became. It wasn't just a bad policy, it was a calculated, systemic effort to prioritize the wealthy while pushing aside those who didn't matter in the eyes of the company. It wasn't just about poor customer service, it was something far more sinister. But as he sifted through the materials, another pressing issue loomed. Michael Dawson, the marketing director, had been circling around him for days, and it was only a matter of time before he would confront Edward. Michael, with his sharp suits and polished smile, had always had the aura of someone who thrived in a world of calculated risk and maneuvering. Edward knew that Michael's ambitions were as vast as his influence. If anyone was going to defend the status quo, it would be him. It wasn't long before Edward got the call he had been anticipating. Michael wanted to meet. "Edward, I know what you're doing," Michael said bluntly, leaning across the desk during their meeting. His eyes held a cold intensity, and there was no mistaking the threat in his voice. "I won't pretend to not notice. You're digging into things that are better left alone. And if you keep going down this road, I'll make sure the entire company knows just how much you've been hiding behind that CEO facade of yours." Edward's face remained calm, but his insides churned. The threat was clear, and Michael wasn't just talking about the current investigation. He was warning him to stop. "Or else, I'm not hiding anything," Edward replied evenly, "but I do think it's time for some transparency in this company. There's a lot we don't know, and a lot that's being kept in the shadows." Michael's expression didn't waver. "You don't understand the bigger picture here. I've been building relationships with key investors who will help propel this company into new markets. If you go public with this, if you expose the policies you're worried about, you'll destroy all of that. You'll make enemies of people who are far more powerful than you realize." Edward knew Michael well enough to understand that he was driven by something deeper than just corporate growth. There was a relentless ambition to keep everything running smoothly and his own position secure. To him, the company wasn't just a business, it was his kingdom. "You're not the only one with ambition, Michael," Edward said quietly, his gaze hardening. "And I'm not going to back down. People deserve better than this. It's time to clean house." Michael leaned back in his chair, a smirk creeping onto his face. "You think you're some kind of hero, don't you?" he said, "trying to change everything for the sake of fairness. But you're playing with fire. Keep pushing this, and it'll ruin you. Do you really want to put everything at risk over something so insignificant?" "I'm not backing off," Edward replied firmly. "And if you think your threats will stop me, you're wrong. I'll expose the truth, no matter the cost." As the conversation ended, Michael's smirk remained, but the tension in the air lingered. Edward knew this wasn't over, not by a long shot. Michael would do whatever it took to protect his interests, and Edward could feel the weight of the battle ahead. The next day, Edward sat in on a crucial meeting with investors, their faces familiar but cold. Michael had organized the gathering to pitch new policies that would make the company more competitive in the global market. The investors were keen, eager to hear Michael's ideas about expanding the airline's reach. But as the meeting wore on, Edward's attention was elsewhere. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, that Michael was glossing over something important. It wasn't until Michael presented a set of documents that Edward's suspicions were confirmed. These papers, meant to be a part of the new policy rollout, had been doctored. The numbers didn't add up. And the new proposals were a thinly veiled attempt to perpetuate the very system that discriminated against certain customers. One document in particular stood out to Edward. It was a report on customer satisfaction. The document was supposed to demonstrate the company's efforts to improve service for all passengers. Instead, it only outlined ways to increase profits at the expense of lower income and military customers. It was a calculated move to appear progressive while keeping things just the way they were. Edward's pulse quickened as he scanned the forged papers. This wasn't just about an isolated policy error. This was a deliberate cover-up. Someone was using these meetings to continue pushing discriminatory practices under the guise of progress. He sat back in his chair, trying to process what he had just discovered. Michael was clever, too clever, and the more Edward thought about it, the clearer it became that the plot went far beyond just changing the service policies. There were far-reaching consequences. And if Edward didn't act quickly, the damage could be irreversible. Edward's decision was made in that moment. He had to expose this before it spiraled further out of control. But there was no turning back now. If he was going to fight this battle, he needed to do it carefully, with precision. He couldn't afford any more mistakes. The game had changed, and Edward knew that the stakes were higher than he had imagined. The conference room was buzzing with tension as the top executives of the airline filed in. Edward Miller, though not a stranger to such high-pressure meetings, could feel the weight of this one settle heavily on his shoulders. Today wasn't just about business decisions or future projections. Today, everything he had been working toward, everything he had uncovered, would come to a head. Edward's fingers drummed lightly on the polished wood of the conference table as he waited for the meeting to begin. The air in the room was thick with anticipation, but also with something else, a sense of dread that he couldn't quite shake. He had known for days now that the company's leadership was preparing to pass new policies. Policies that would further entrench the inequality and discrimination that had begun to surface. This meeting wasn't just a routine gathering, it was the moment of reckoning. As the room filled with the company's executives, all eyes slowly turned to Michael Dawson, the marketing director. Michael's presence was undeniable, his sharp suit, his confident smile, and the air of authority he carried with him. He was a man who knew how to command a room. And today, Edward knew, he would be using every ounce of his charisma to push through a series of changes that would only solidify the company's toxic culture. Michael was quick to speak up, a familiar smirk on his face. "Ladies and gentlemen, today is a pivotal moment for our airline. We're on the brink of a new chapter, one that will see us reaching new heights, expanding our influence, and increasing profitability." Edward sat still, his jaw tightening. He knew what Michael's words meant. They weren't just about growth, they were about protecting the old way of doing things. The way of privileging the wealthy and dismissing the needs of those who didn't matter in their eyes. Edward had seen enough. The time to speak up had arrived. As Michael continued to outline his plans, Edward couldn't keep quiet any longer. "Hold on a second, Michael," Edward said, his voice cutting through the chatter like a knife. The room fell silent as all eyes shifted to him. He met Michael's gaze, his eyes steely and determined. "Before we go any further, I think it's time we discuss the elephant in the room." Michael's smile faltered for just a second, but it was quickly replaced by the usual smugness. "What are you talking about, Edward?" he asked, his tone laced with thinly veiled condescension. "I'm talking about the way we've been treating our customers," Edward said, leaning forward, "especially the ones who don't fit the profile of the wealthy and influential. Veterans, low-income families, these people deserve better from us. And I have the evidence to prove that our current policies are built to shut them out." There was an uneasy silence as the other executives exchanged glances. Michael's expression hardened, and he quickly regained control of the room. "You're really going to sit there and accuse us of discriminating, Edward?" Michael's voice was calm, but there was an edge to it now. "You're out of line." Edward didn't flinch. He knew the stakes. "I've seen the documents, Michael. I've seen the reports. The way our airline prioritizes certain passengers, at the expense of others, is wrong. And it's not just a matter of bad service, it's a matter of fairness. This company was built on the idea of offering a level playing field. And we've lost that." Michael's eyes narrowed. "Edward, you're missing the point," he said slowly, as if speaking to a child. This isn't about fairness, it's about the survival of the company. If we don't make these changes, if we don't cater to the right kind of customer, then we'll be left behind. These decisions aren't personal, they're strategic. Edward's blood boiled at the cold pragmatism in Michael's voice. He could feel the weight of the situation pressing on him. But he refused to back down. You think this is just about making money? Edward's voice rose slightly. This is about people. This is about what's right. If we continue down this path, we'll lose everything that once made this company great. Michael opened his mouth to respond. But before he could, there was a sudden interruption. One of the senior executives, Lisa Harris, who had been quiet until now, stood up abruptly. I can't do this anymore, she said, her voice shaky. I can't support this. I'm out. Edward's eyes widened. He hadn't expected this. Lisa had always been a staunch ally, someone he could count on in moments like this. But now, she was walking away. Lisa, wait, Edward started, but she shook her head. I can't be part of this. Edward, not anymore, she said, her voice growing distant as she turned to leave the room. The room fell into a stunned silence. And for a brief moment, Edward's resolve faltered. His ally was gone. But then, a cold realization hit him. This wasn't just about Michael. There were others in the room. Others who had been complicit. Others who saw what Edward was trying to expose as a threat to their power. As the meeting continued, Michael took advantage of the shift in momentum. He pressed on with his pitch, outlining the changes with more urgency. But Edward wasn't listening. His mind was racing. Something was wrong. Something much bigger than just corporate policy. Just then, his phone buzzed on the table, snapping him back to reality. It was a message from Sarah. The document you were going to use, gone. It's been erased from the system. Edward's heart sank. Everything he had worked for was slipping through his fingers. The documents, the proof, it was all being erased. The cover-up was deeper than he had imagined. He glanced up at Michael, who had returned to his presentation, his smile never wavering. Edward now knew that Michael wasn't just trying to protect the company, he was trying to protect himself. And it was up to Edward to stop him. There was no turning back now. The gloves were off. Edward sat in his office late into the night, the weight of the world pressing on his shoulders. His mind was racing, but he couldn't shake the image of Sarah's face as she walked away. The betrayal from one of his most trusted allies hurt more than he had expected. Sarah Miller had been instrumental in helping him uncover the airline's internal corruption. But now she was out of the picture, at least for the time being. Michael Dawson's move to neutralize Edward had been swift and effective. He had rallied his allies within the company, and it was clear that the forces against Edward were more organized than he had initially believed. A quiet meeting had been arranged with the investors, the people who held the keys to the company's future. Michael had used the opportunity to apply pressure, convincing the investors that Edward was no longer fit to lead the company. His actions, Michael claimed, were jeopardizing the airline's profitability and stability. Edward wasn't just fighting against a corrupt system anymore, he was now up against the very people who held the power to decide his fate. Edward had anticipated that the battle would be difficult, but he hadn't expected this level of betrayal. Michael was no longer just an adversary, he had become a formidable opponent, willing to do whatever it took to maintain control. The investors, once supportive of Edward's vision, now seemed to waver. He had lost their trust, and with it, the momentum to push for the changes the company so desperately needed. As if the pressure wasn't enough, Edward received an unexpected blow when Sarah, his closest ally, backed out. She had been cornered by the powers within the company, threatened with the very things she had feared. Under immense pressure, she withdrew from the investigation, leaving Edward to face this fight alone. The sting of her decision cut deeper than any corporate maneuver, and for the first time since this ordeal had begun, Edward felt a profound loneliness. He had fought alone before, but this felt different. He had lost a key player, someone who truly understood the stakes of this battle. Without Sarah's help, Edward sought support from outside the company. He reached out to various advocacy groups, including those for veterans, hoping to gather allies who shared his vision. But the support he sought was not as easy to secure as he had hoped. The groups were cautious, wary of becoming entangled in a battle that could jeopardize their own agendas. Trust was hard to come by. especially with a company as powerful as the one Edward was up against. Meanwhile, Michael's grip on power only tightened. He continued to manipulate the situation, using his influence to neutralize anyone who posed a threat to his position. He played the game of corporate politics expertly, using fear, intimidation, and persuasion to maintain control. Edward could see the pieces falling into place, and it became clear that Michael was not going to let go of his power easily. The system Edward was fighting against was not just a handful of bad policies, it was a deeply ingrained network of influence and manipulation. But just when things seemed most dire, Edward received a call that changed everything. It was from an old contact in the government, someone he hadn't spoken to in years. The man, a former ally who had once helped Edward navigate through political challenges, was reaching out with an offer of assistance. "I know what you're up against, Edward," the voice on the other end of the line said. "I've seen the corruption for myself, and I'm willing to help. We can expose this. You have a powerful ally on your side." Edward's heart lifted slightly. This was the break he had been hoping for. He had an inside track now, someone in a position of power who could help him expose Michael and the corrupt system within the company. It felt like a glimmer of hope in an otherwise bleak situation. But as quickly as that hope had risen, it was dashed. Just days after the phone call, Edward received devastating news. His political ally had been ousted from their position. The timing was too perfect to be a coincidence. Michael's network of influence extended far beyond the corporate world. It had reached into politics. And now his rival had been silenced. Edward's plan to expose the corruption through his ally was shattered before it even had a chance to take shape. The setback was crushing, but Edward wasn't ready to give up. The odds were stacked against him, but he wasn't one to back down easily. If Michael thought this would be enough to stop him, he was wrong. Edward knew that the truth still needed to come out, and he was willing to do whatever it took to make sure it did. Determined, Edward began to formulate a new plan. If he couldn't rely on political power or corporate allies, he would take his fight directly to the people. It was time to go public. He would use the media to expose the company's actions, to reveal the truth to the world. He would make sure the public knew what was happening behind the scenes. And he would make Michael's manipulation and the company's discrimination impossible to ignore. The task was daunting, but Edward had no other choice. The stakes were higher than ever, and if he didn't act now, Michael and his allies would continue to thrive in the shadows. Edward couldn't allow that to happen. The battle was far from over, and he was ready to fight it to the end. The city buzzed with excitement as Michael Dawson took center stage at the grand event. Designed to boost the image of the airline, the event was lavish, with bright lights, a luxurious venue, and an air of triumph that enveloped everything. Michael had invited key investors, media representatives, and influential figures from various industries to showcase the airline's latest successes and promising future. As he stood before the crowd, his words were carefully chosen, designed to paint the company in the best possible light. "We've achieved remarkable growth," Michael declared, his voice booming over the applause. "And today marks the beginning of an even brighter future. We are expanding our reach, improving our services, and making changes that will set us apart as the leader in the industry." His words were smooth, charismatic, the kind of speech that could win over even the most skeptical listener. It was all too perfect, a display of confidence that left little room for doubt. But behind the scenes, Edward knew the truth. These reforms were just a facade, a way to mask the deeper, more corrupt practices that had been driving the company's decisions. This was the moment he had been waiting for, the moment to expose the reality behind Michael's smooth talk. Edward had been quietly preparing for this day, gathering more evidence, forging new alliances. He had a plan, one that would bring Michael's manipulations into the light. As the event unfolded, Edward knew the time had come. He had to act. With the spotlight on him, Edward stood up from his seat, a sense of calm determination settling over him. His heart was pounding in his chest, but his resolve was stronger than ever. He walked towards the stage, the eyes of the room following him. Michael's smirk faltered, just slightly, as Edward approached. "This company's success," Edward began, his voice steady, "has come at a price. A price paid by those who have been pushed aside, the veterans, the working-class families, and the ones who don't fit the mold that this company has so carefully crafted. The truth is, while you've been focusing on growth, you've neglected what really matters: fairness. There was a collective gasp from the audience as Edward held up a document. The crowd fell silent as he began reading from it: detailed reports on customer discrimination, evidence of manipulated policies, all compiled in the very document Michael had tried to bury. Edward felt the weight of his actions. But there was no turning back. But just as he was about to reveal the final piece of the puzzle, something unexpected happened. Sarah Miller, the investigative journalist who had been his ally, walked into the room. The room went cold as she made her way to the stage. But what happened next was far worse than Edward could have anticipated. With a steady voice, Sarah turned to the crowd and spoke. "Ladies and gentlemen, I'm afraid the truth is more complicated than Edward's sources would have you believe. The documents he's showing you have been tampered with. The person who provided him with this information, well, they're not who you think they are." Edward's stomach dropped. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. Sarah, the very person who had been helping him uncover the truth, had just betrayed him. She had been the one who had exposed the lies in the company. And now, here she was, turning against him in front of everyone. As Sarah continued to speak, she revealed that one of Edward's closest allies had been secretly working with Michael, feeding him false information to discredit Edward's investigation. The documents, which Edward had hoped would be his proof of Michael's wrongdoing, were now exposed as fake, an elaborate setup designed to turn the tables on him. The betrayal stung like a slap in the face. Edward's carefully laid plans had just crumbled before his eyes. He had trusted Sarah, had put his faith in her, only to have her pull the rug out from under him in the most public way possible. His heart raced as the room seemed to close in around him. He had been so close to bringing the truth to light, but now, everything was slipping away. Michael's face lit up with triumph as the crowd, initially stunned, began to murmur in disbelief. The damage was done. Edward's reputation had been shattered, and the evidence he had worked so hard to gather had been destroyed. It was a well-executed strategy by Michael and his allies, one that turned Edward's counterattack into chaos. But even as he stood there, humiliated and defeated, Edward refused to give up. He had been knocked down, but he wasn't out. Michael's victory was fleeting. Edward's mind was already working on his next move. The truth was still there, buried beneath the lies and deception, and he was determined to find a way to uncover it. He had to act quickly. If he didn't, the whole fight would be lost. Edward walked off the stage, his heart heavy but his resolve hardened. There had to be another way. He had lost this battle, but the war was far from over, and Michael, no matter how clever, couldn't keep the truth buried forever. The night after the public event felt like a dark cloud hanging over Edward. His initial plans had been derailed, and the momentum he had worked so hard to build had evaporated in a matter of hours. But even with the sting of betrayal from Sarah and the swift counterattack by Michael and his allies, Edward wasn't ready to give up. He had been through worse before. This was just another test, one he was determined to pass. As days passed, Edward didn't sit idly by. He continued to dig deeper. Even when the walls seemed to close in around him, he knew the fight wasn't over. It was far from it. Despite the failure of his public counterattack, he discovered something that reignited his hope: a new lead, a fresh trail of evidence that pointed to deeper corruption within the company. This time, the problem wasn't just in the customer service policies, it was embedded in the higher echelons of the company itself. Edward's investigation uncovered links between certain high-ranking company officials and external organizations with questionable ties. These were not just minor infractions, these were deals that, if exposed, could bring down the entire corporation. He found clear indications of bribes, backroom deals, and the manipulation of both financial and public relations strategies designed to keep the company's darker secrets hidden from the public eye. The evidence was damning, and Edward knew he had finally found the smoking gun. But as he pieced together the puzzle, he realized that Michael and his allies were already preparing to cover up these latest revelations. Michael wasn't just playing defense anymore, he was going on the offense. Manipulating public perception with an expertly crafted media strategy. The focus shifted from the company's wrongdoings to its successes, making it difficult for anyone to distinguish the truth from the lies. The carefully curated image of success was meant to overshadow the growing scandal and distract from the ongoing investigation. It was a well-oiled machine, and Edward was beginning to realize just how deeply embedded Michael's control over the company was. He wasn't just fighting a battle within the company, he was fighting a public relations war. But even as the pressure mounted, Edward held on to the one thing that gave him strength: the truth. He wasn't going to let Michael control the narrative forever. Then, an unexpected opportunity appeared. A crucial board meeting was scheduled to decide the company's future. The agenda was supposed to focus on the company's expansion and potential mergers. But Edward knew the real decisions would be made behind the scenes. This was the moment. He couldn't let it slip away. He had to act before Michael's stranglehold on the company became too powerful to break. Edward had gathered enough evidence to make a compelling case. But this wasn't just about proving that the company had been corrupt, it was about fighting for what was right. He wasn't just exposing wrongdoing for the sake of justice, he was fighting for the company's soul. For the people who had been hurt by its policies. As the meeting began, Edward took his place in the back of the room, watching as the members of the board filed in, their faces unreadable. Michael was already seated at the head of the table, the master of ceremonies, confident in his ability to sway the room. Edward's heart beat fast, but he stayed calm. He knew this was his chance to turn the tide. Just as he was about to stand up and speak, an unexpected voice interrupted him. One of the largest shareholders, Thomas Bennett, a man Edward hadn't anticipated would be on his side, stood up. "I've been watching this situation unfold, and I have to say, I'm not happy with the way things are going," Thomas said, his voice steady and clear. "It's time someone spoke the truth." The room fell silent. Michael's face tightened, but he didn't immediately respond. Thomas had just thrown a wrench in Michael's plans. This was the opening Edward needed. Thomas was a key player, and his support was invaluable. But even as Edward's hopes surged, he knew this wasn't going to be easy. The board members exchanged wary glances as the tension thickened. Edward seized the moment, rising from his seat and addressing the room. "Gentlemen, we stand at a crossroads. This company has been built on lies, on exploiting those who have trusted us. But I have the proof that shows how deep the corruption runs. And how many people have been hurt by the very policies that have made us profitable." Edward's voice rang out with authority, his words sharp and cutting. "These aren't just small mistakes. These are calculated moves designed to enrich a select few at the expense of the rest. And I won't sit by while this company, and the people who have trusted it, are destroyed." As Edward laid out the evidence, detailing the financial manipulations and the corporate cover-ups, Michael's expression darkened. He shot up from his seat. But before he could interrupt, Edward pressed on. "Look at what we've become." Edward sighed, his eyes scanning the room. "We have the power to make things right, but only if we are willing to face the truth." The room was in chaos now. The board members were divided, some backing Edward's claims, others siding with Michael. As the heated debate continued, Edward could feel the pressure mounting. This wasn't just about changing policies anymore, it was about changing the very nature of the company. And with it, the future of everything he had worked for. But then, as the argument reached its peak, Michael made his move. He tried to regain control by diverting the conversation, pointing to Edward's so-called lack of leadership and questioning his judgment. He leaned into the drama, making it about Edward's character rather than the company's actions. His manipulation was slick, and for a moment, it seemed to shift the tide back in his favor. The battle was far from over. Edward knew he had made progress, but Michael's hold on the board was still strong. With Thomas Bennett's support, the foundation had been shaken. But the final blow hadn't landed yet. Edward couldn't give up, not now. He had to push harder, use every tool at his disposal to bring the truth to light. Michael was powerful, but he wasn't invincible. Edward's mind raced as he devised his next move. There was more to be done, and he wasn't backing down. Edward stood before the mirror in his office. The reflection staring back at him seemed more determined than ever. His thoughts raced, each piece of evidence, each detail, all leading up to this moment. He knew this was his last chance, his final opportunity to dismantle Michael Dawson's empire and expose the corruption that had festered in the company for so long. There could be no turning back after today. If this failed, everything he had worked for, everything he had uncovered, would be lost. But if he succeeded, the company would change forever. The room was set for a pivotal board meeting, one that would decide the fate of the company's future. It wasn't just a routine discussion of numbers and projections. Today's meeting would determine whether Michael would continue to hold the reins or whether Edward could wrestle control back and right the wrongs that had been done. The evidence Edward had painstakingly gathered, the deals, the bribes, and the backdoor exchanges, was ready to be revealed. This was his moment to expose everything and ensure that Michael and his allies faced the consequences of their actions. Edward was prepared, unlike before, when he had been caught off guard. This time he had allies, real allies, who believed in the cause. Sarah Miller had returned, determined to help him bring the truth to light. The support of several key board members, swayed by the evidence Edward had presented, gave him confidence. Today wasn't just about fighting Michael, it was about delivering justice. Not just for himself, but for the people who had been hurt by Michael's schemes. The atmosphere in the room was thick with anticipation as the board members settled in. Michael sat at the head of the table, exuding his usual air of superiority. His eyes met Edward's for a brief moment, but there was no trace of fear. Michael had no idea what was coming. He was still convinced that he could talk his way out of this, just as he had with every other obstacle that had come his way. But Edward wasn't going to let him. Michael began the meeting with his usual rhetoric, painting a picture of the company's growth, its market expansion, and the successful deals that were about to be finalized. But Edward wasn't there to listen to empty promises. He waited for the right moment, watching Michael with a steady gaze. The time to act was near. When the room fell quiet for a brief moment, Edward rose from his seat. His voice was calm but powerful as he spoke. Michael, I have no intention of letting this meeting proceed without first addressing something that has been ignored for too long. The truth about this company, and the man at the top of it, is about to be laid bare for everyone to see. The room shifted, uncomfortable murmurs rippling through the board members. Michael's jaw tightened as he glared at Edward, his fingers curling around the edge of the table. He opened his mouth to respond, but Edward was ready. With a swift motion, he handed over a set of documents to the board, laying them down one by one. The room fell silent as the board members began to skim through the incriminating evidence, documents outlining illegal transactions, money laundering schemes, and backdoor dealings with outside organizations. These were the same deals Michael had been hiding, the very ones he had worked tirelessly to keep buried. Edward didn't stop there. This is just the tip of the iceberg, he continued, his voice steady. What you see here is the product of years of manipulation, corruption, and exploitation. Michael Dawson and his allies have been using this company to line their pockets while disregarding the people who made it all possible: customers, employees, and investors. Just as Edward prepared to reveal the final piece of his evidence, a comprehensive document that connected Michael to the larger web of corruption, something unexpected happened. A voice cut through the tension in the room. I can't let you do this, Edward. It was Thomas Bennett, one of the largest shareholders in the company, who had previously been seen as a supporter of Michael. But to everyone's surprise, Thomas stood up from his seat and turned to face the rest of the room. I've been quiet long enough, he said, his voice calm but firm. I've seen enough to know that this company is rotting from the inside out. And I won't sit by while Michael continues to destroy it. Edward's heart raced. This was the moment he had been waiting for. The shift in power was happening right before his eyes. Michael's face drained of color as he tried to maintain his composure. But he knew, deep down, that his carefully crafted facade was crumbling. Michael, Thomas continued, his voice full of authority, you've taken this company for a ride, and I'm done letting you do it. We've all seen the truth, and now it's time to act. The room erupted into chaos as the board members exchanged heated words, divided between those who supported Michael and those who had seen the light. Edward watched as Michael's confident stance faltered. For the first time, he wasn't in control. But just as the tide seemed to turn in Edward's favor, Michael, desperate to regain his grip on power, made a last-ditch effort. This is slander, he shouted, his voice shaking with rage. Edward is lying. This is all a conspiracy. He's trying to ruin everything we've built. But Edward didn't flinch. He had the truth on his side. And he wasn't going to let Michael twist the narrative again. The truth is in front of you, Edward Said. his eyes unwavering. "You've spent years covering your tracks. But now it's all coming to light. You can't hide from this anymore." As the arguments escalated, a final bombshell dropped. One of Michael's closest allies, a key figure in the boardroom, stood up and publicly declared his support for Edward. "I've been part of this for too long," he confessed, "and I can't keep turning a blind eye. The corruption ends now." The room went silent. Michael's face went pale, his last ally turning on him in a moment of sheer betrayal. The weight of the situation hit him like a freight train. His empire was collapsing, and he knew it. Despite his desperate attempts to hold on, Michael couldn't stop the truth from coming to light. The board members, now firmly aligned with Edward, voted to remove Michael from his position as CEO. The evidence was undeniable. Michael had lost his grip on power, and the company was finally free of his influence. As the room erupted in applause, Edward stood still for a moment, letting the gravity of the moment sink in. It wasn't just a victory for him, it was a victory for everyone who had been hurt by Michael's manipulation. But the war was not over. Edward knew that this was just the beginning of rebuilding what had been broken. With a steady breath, he turned to Sarah, his most trusted ally, and nodded. "We did it." The moment Michael Dawson was ousted from his position as CEO, a heavy weight seemed to lift off Edward's shoulders. The boardroom was filled with murmurs of disbelief as the man who had ruled with an iron fist for so long was finally brought down. His smug, self-assured expression had faltered for the first time, and the once dominant presence of Michael now felt insignificant as the truth about his actions spread like wildfire. The very system Michael had built, one that was based on manipulation, deceit, and corruption, was crumbling. But even as the sense of victory hung in the air, Edward couldn't ignore the cost. There were repercussions. The board had made it clear that any involvement with Michael's network of manipulation would not go unpunished. Key employees who had been complicit in his actions, who had benefited from the company's corrupt dealings, were either fired or placed under investigation. For every person who lost their job, there was a sense of relief for the company, but also an undeniable sorrow. The corporate environment had been fractured, and the aftermath was something Edward could never have prepared for. While the company was now free of its corrupt leadership, it still had a long road to recovery ahead. Edward and his allies had worked tirelessly to root out the toxic practices that had infiltrated the company. But repairing the damage done to its culture would take time. The new leadership team was dedicated to creating a company that was fair, transparent, and focused on its customers. Yet, the work was just beginning. There was still a need to rebuild trust, not just within the walls of the company, but also with its customers and partners. As Edward sat at his desk late one evening, reviewing the plans for restructuring, he reflected on how far he had come. The company would undergo a complete transformation. Policies that had once supported inequality and favoritism were being rewritten. A new customer service strategy was in place, one that emphasized fairness and compassion, particularly toward veterans and those who had been neglected in the past. The company's focus would no longer be solely on profit margins but on making real, lasting changes that benefited everyone involved. It was clear, though, that change didn't just happen overnight. The employees who remained after the purge had to adjust to a new way of doing business, and some were resistant to the changes. The road ahead was uncertain, but Edward felt a sense of purpose stronger than ever. The fight hadn't just been about removing Michael, it had been about creating a company that could stand for something better, something more just. And yet, even as Edward felt a semblance of peace begin to settle in, the phone rang. The call came late at night, and as Edward picked up, he could immediately tell that it wasn't a routine call. The voice on the other end was calm, but it sent a chill down his spine. "There's something you need to know," the voice said. "We've been watching, and the truth you think you've uncovered, well, there's more to the story. There's still a threat within the company. The game isn't over." Edward's grip on the phone tightened. This wasn't over. Despite Michael's fall from grace, the shadows of the past were not so easily shaken. Someone within the company was still working behind the scenes, and Edward knew that this new challenge might be just as dangerous as the one he had just faced. He had hoped that after Michael's downfall, peace would settle over the company, but now he realized that the real fight had only just begun. As he hung up the phone, Edward felt a knot form in his stomach. This was the moment he had feared. He had won the battle. But the war was still ongoing. Whoever was behind this new threat knew too much. And they were still lurking within the company. But Edward wasn't about to back down. He had come this far. And he wasn't about to stop now. Looking out the window of his office, Edward could see the lights of the city stretching out before him. The darkened streets illuminated by the faint glow of streetlights. This wasn't just a victory for him. It was a victory for everyone who had ever been wronged by the company's past practices. But the challenge ahead would require more than just leadership. It would take vigilance, strategy, and the unyielding determination to fight against the injustices that still threatened the company's future. Edward took a deep breath, the weight of everything settling into his chest. He wasn't just fighting to fix the company, he was fighting to change the system from within. The old way of doing business, the old way of thinking, had to be destroyed, and Edward was committed to making sure that no injustice would be allowed to survive under his watch. His journey wasn't over, not by a long shot. The final blow was struck, and the sound of it echoed through the corridors of the company. Michael Dawson, once the untouchable CEO who had weaved a network of corruption and manipulation, was now facing the consequences of his actions. Edward watched from his office as news reports flashed across screens, revealing the downfall of Michael and his loyalists. The system that Michael had built over the years, one that had prioritized greed, exploitation, and deceit, was coming undone. His fall from power was swift, as the full weight of his crimes, bribery, money laundering, and corporate espionage, were exposed for the world to see. It didn't take long for the law to catch up with him. Michael was arrested, along with several of his key allies, all of whom had been complicit in his schemes. Investigations were launched, and the public began to learn the full extent of Michael's manipulation. His once impressive career as a marketing director was destroyed, and his name became synonymous with corporate corruption. All of the evidence Edward had uncovered and bravely revealed in the past months had now led to this moment. Justice was served, though not without a high cost. As Michael's empire crumbled, Edward couldn't help but reflect on the journey that had brought him here. It had been a long, painful battle, but one that had, in the end, proven worth the sacrifices. And while the satisfaction of seeing Michael's downfall was undeniable, there was still a lingering sense of emptiness, a feeling that the war was not truly over. The company, though rid of Michael, had a long road ahead. The damage done to its reputation, the betrayals, the turmoil, these were scars that would not heal overnight. But Edward was determined to move forward, to rebuild the trust that had been shattered. And he wasn't doing it alone. The support he had gained from loyal employees, stakeholders, and even some of the board members who had once backed Michael was now more vital than ever. Edward's reforms began to take root. The changes were felt across the company. There was a new atmosphere, one of fairness and transparency. Employees, once fearful of the system, now felt empowered to speak up, knowing that the company's leadership had their backs. The customers who had been neglected and mistreated were now at the heart of the company's mission. And, most importantly, veterans, the very individuals who had been pushed to the margins, were now treated with the respect and dignity they deserved. The new policies Edward championed were clear. Equality, fairness, and integrity were no longer just words, they were the company's foundation. But despite all the victories, there was still something weighing heavily on Edward's mind. As much as he had succeeded in rooting out the corruption, as much as the company had turned a new page, he knew that changing the system itself, changing the culture that had allowed someone like Michael to rise to power, was going to take more than just a few reforms. The real work had just begun. Edward's resolve only strengthened as he recognized the depth of the challenge. It's not enough just to fix the company, he thought. The system itself must change. And he wasn't going to stop here. This wasn't about winning one battle, it was about winning the war for justice, for fairness, for the values that had always been in jeopardy. Edward had already fought for these values in the most difficult circumstances. But he understood now that this was a fight that required constant vigilance. It was about setting a precedent, about ensuring that no future leader could ever repeat Michael's mistakes. As time passed, Edward continued to lead the company with a firm but compassionate hand. The business was growing again, and he was committed to making sure the company remained on the right path. But in his heart, He knew the journey wasn't over. There would always be more challenges, more forces at play, trying to return things to the way they were. But Edward was no longer the naive man who had first walked into this fight. He had learned, he had grown, and he was ready for whatever came next. The phone rang one afternoon, interrupting his quiet reflection. The voice on the other end was familiar, but the message was unsettling. Edward, there's something else, something we missed. We've been keeping an eye on the situation, and there's still a lingering threat. Edward felt a chill run down his spine. What do you mean? He asked, his voice steady despite the unease. The voice on the other end hesitated for a moment before continuing. We've identified a new layer to this whole mess. It's not over. The people who were behind Michael, there's more to it. A new scheme, maybe even bigger than what you've already uncovered. Edward's heart skipped a beat. It wasn't over. The fight had only been a chapter, not the whole story. This wasn't just about cleaning up the past, it was about preparing for the future. The work ahead would be tougher, but Edward had proven time and again that he was willing to take on any challenge. No matter how daunting. He took a deep breath, staring out the window as the sun began to set. The fight for justice, for change, was far from over, but Edward was ready. The company that Edward had once known, riddled with corruption and manipulation, was now slowly finding its footing again. After months of turmoil, the new policies had finally started to take shape, and there was a marked difference in the air. Employees, once wary and fearful, were now embracing the changes with a sense of hope. Customers, who had been treated unfairly, began to see improvements in the way they were treated, particularly veterans, who were once pushed aside. The company was no longer just a machine for profits, it had become a company that valued fairness and integrity. But as Edward stood in his office, looking out over the bustling city below, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The changes were significant, yes, but they were still only the surface of what needed to be done. The battles won had not erased the deep-rooted issues within the company or in the broader system. The feeling that something was still lurking just beneath the surface persisted. Edward had come to realize something over the course of this long journey. Fighting for justice and truth wasn't a one-time battle. It was an ongoing war. While he had successfully exposed some of the most egregious injustices and implemented reforms, he knew there were still those who sought to manipulate the system for their own gain. Corruption, Edward understood, didn't vanish overnight. It could resurface in new forms, hidden behind the very policies designed to protect the company's interests. His mind wandered to the lessons he had learned during the fight. He had thought that exposing Michael Dawson and his inner circle would be the end of his struggle. But the truth was far more complicated. Michael was just one part of a much larger problem. The real challenge, as Edward had come to see it, wasn't just about bringing down one man. It was about eradicating the system that allowed someone like him to rise in the first place. That system was still in place, quietly waiting for an opportunity to strike back. As Edward sat back in his chair, reflecting on his next steps, he heard a soft knock on the door. He looked up, startled by the interruption. A man stood in the doorway. Someone he hadn't seen in a while, Jeffrey, a former employee who had worked in the company's legal department before it all started to unravel. He looked disheveled, as though he hadn't been keeping up with his usual appearances. In his hands, he held a thick stack of papers, his face tense with urgency. "I need to speak with you," Jeffrey said quietly. Stepping inside, Edward motioned for him to sit. His curiosity piqued. "What's this about, Jeffrey?" Without a word, Jeffrey handed over the documents. "I think you need to see this. It's about something bigger, much bigger than anything you've uncovered so far." Edward took the papers, feeling the weight of them in his hands. As he flipped through the first few pages, his heart sank. It was more than just corporate misconduct, it was something far more insidious. The documents laid out a web of connections, leading to higher-level figures who had been operating under the radar. There were whispers of power plays, financial dealings with foreign entities, and a level of corruption that reached beyond the company's walls. Edward's mind raced. Was this the beginning of a new conspiracy? Or was this the last vestige of the old regime, clawing its way back into power? "This can't be happening," Edward muttered, more to himself than to Jeffrey. "We just brought down one corrupt system. And now this? Jeffrey nodded gravely. I didn't want to get involved again. But I couldn't just walk away without telling you. I've seen enough to know that this isn't over. There's a new threat, and it's already taking shape within the company. I don't know who's behind it. But someone is pulling strings. Someone bigger than Michael. Edward felt the weight of the situation pressing down on him. He had fought for so long to expose the truth, to change the company for the better. He thought he had won. He thought he had finally brought an end to the corruption that had plagued the company for so long. But now, this new information, this new conspiracy, felt like a punch to the gut. The fight wasn't over, not by a long shot. He looked up at Jeffrey, who was watching him carefully, as though waiting for a reaction. Edward sighed deeply, his resolve firming. I can't walk away from this. I didn't come this far to let it all unravel now. Jeffrey seemed to sense the shift in Edward's demeanor, the unspoken promise in his eyes. He knew that Edward wasn't going to rest until he had uncovered the full extent of the conspiracy. No matter how deep it went. Edward stood up, pacing slowly across the room. His mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, each one more pressing than the last. This wasn't just about righting the wrongs of the past anymore. This was about ensuring that the future of the company, and the people who depended on it, wouldn't fall victim to another corrupt system. What's the next step? Edward asked, turning to Jeffrey. We need to dig deeper. Jeffrey replied, there's no telling how far this goes. But I think we can start by tracking the financial trails. They always leave a paper trail. Edward nodded, his mind already racing through the possibilities. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. It would be filled with risks, threats, and enemies who would stop at nothing to protect their secrets. But he was ready. He had been ready for this moment since the very first time he uncovered Michael's deceit. Looking at the documents in his hand, Edward knew that the real battle had only just begun. He wasn't just fighting to fix the company anymore. He was fighting for something bigger, something that would require every ounce of his strength, courage, and resolve. The war for justice was far from over, and Edward was prepared to see it through to the very end. As we wrap up this incredible journey, one thing stands clear: justice may not always come easily, but it will always find a way to prevail. The story serves as a powerful reminder that standing up for what's right, even when faced with overwhelming odds, is always worth it. It's not just about changing systems, it's about changing lives. One truth at a time. What do you think? How far would you go to stand up for justice? Share your thoughts with us in the comments below. And if you haven't already, be sure to subscribe to Undercover Truths for more eye-opening stories that challenge the system and inspire change. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.